Привіт! Це подкаст «Коли все має значення». Я Ангеліна Карякіна, а зі мною традиційно
Наталка Гуменюк. Рада чути, говорити і розповісти, що мала на увазі завжди цього гостя для нашого подкасту. Він дуже є типовою людиною і важливою для нього, але в цьому випадку знову чекала на особисту зустріч у Відні. Це Карл Генрік Фредріксон, який є європейським інтелектуалом, він є шведським колумністом, який багато років живе у Відні, і він є засновником мережі культурних журналів Eurozine і програмним директором дебатів про Європу.
Насправді, Карл Генрік – один з таких, мені здається, найкрутіших європейських редакторів, публіцистів і інтелектуалів. Я свого часу познайомилася з ним, напевно, в 2015 ще році, під час кризи біженців. Пам'ятаю, як ми з ним про це спілкувалися під час Київської бієнале в Києві, а згодом і у Відні. Звісно, він з великим інтересом і з великими деталями слідкує за всіма ключовими подіями в Європі і за Україною. Скажи, будь ласка, про що ви цього разу говорили? Чи це була Україна, чи ширше?
Я ще додам, що Карл Генрік давно живе у Відні, є тою людиною, як він жартує, яка, напевно, є єдиним іноземцем, який був на всіх українських акціях з часів Майдану, коли туди приходять тільки українці, і є Карл Henrik Fredriksson, бо він вважає, що це надзвичайно важливо. Він є людиною, яка дуже підтримує Україну. Він не є воєнним кореспондентом, не людиною, яка пише про війни. Він, мислить про сучасну Європу. Я завжди Карла Генріка, де б я не була, представляю як найрозумнішу людину, одну з найрозумніших людей, яку я знаю, і загалом присутню в кімнаті, що є правдою. Торік я його, власне, запрошувала на книжковий арсенал, коли я була кураторкою фокус-теми, яка називається «Коли все має значення». І він брав участь у дискусії, яка тоді називалася «Як Україна змінить світ». І що дуже цікаво, він почав свою розмову з того, як власне, з цього і починається подкаст. Напередодні Другої світової Томас Манн почав говорити про те, що європейці і взагалі світ, інтелектуали мають прибрати цю іронічну дистанцію від таких понять, як свобода, правда, демократія. Власне, тоді фокус-тема книжкового арсеналу «Коли все має значення», власне, по суті, відображала цю думку. Тому я хочу також додати цю річ, тому що фактично його розмова дуже суголосна і назві нашого подкасту. Я говорила з ним насамперед, зокрема, й про те, чи повернулася ця іронічна дистанція в європейські, скажімо так, ньюзруми, інтелектуальні салони, розмови, публічну дискусію світову, тому що, було захоплення у перший рік великого вторгнення Україною українцями. А зараз я була у Відні, зокрема на такому заході, який називається «Редакторський круглий стіл», куди раз на рік приїжджають невелика кількість редакторів інтелектуальних видань Сполучених Штатів і Європи, які говорять про важливі теми. Там також відбувається приблизно в цей час Віденський гуманітарний фестиваль, де обговорюються, не знаю, все від штучного інтелекту до... Я там свого часу виступала, коли у 2022 році якісь проблеми сучасності. І в мене, власне, трошечки було таке, я би сказала, враження, я б сказала, не те, що не надто оптимістичне, а відчуття того, що ми повернулися до якоїсь норми, в якій не відчувається той рівень загрози, в якій Україна живе, що знову, якщо, можливо, якраз дистанція до термінів, таких як свобода, повернулася, але так само і зросла дистанція до того, що відбувається в Україні. І я хотіла зрозуміти, наскільки це моє було відчуття, чому воно. Ми говорили також про інтелектуалів і війну, про традицію європейського інтелектуального пацифізму і якою є роль українського героїзму і героїв в українській війні під час цього. Але оскільки ми дуже багато в цьому подкасті якось говоримо і про тему, з якою ми працюємо, відповідальність за злочини, і останні роки дуже багато наша організація приділяла так званому глобальному півдню і Сполученим Штатам, виборам, ми дуже мало говорили про Європу, а я, власне, хотіла розпитати більше про Європу, про те, а що ми можемо розраховувати від Європи, про НАТО. Тому що Карл Генрік є все-таки громадянином Швеції, він живе у Відні, але шведський інтелектуал. Він є таким типовим інтелектуалом, який виступає, скажімо, там за усі демократичні цінності, ліберальні, але був апологетом того, що Швеція має вступити до НАТО. І, напевно, залишається одним з таких найпалкіших захисників і друзів України, зокрема в цьому середовищі. Тому ми здебільшого говорили про Європу, але також говорили про, звісно, Україну і говорили також про російську війну проти України, як все-таки героїчну війну в сучасному контексті, так, як сприймати війну в демократичному світі, де ми можемо її, скажімо, героїзувати, міфологізувати, де є застереження, і як це переосмислити.
А можливо, є якась про нього прикольна історія, яку нам варто згадати?
Я вже згадала, що Карл Генрік не такий типовий воєнкор. Все-таки він приїхав торік до України, йому було важливо, потім він приїжджав і до Львова, але спершу, коли приїздив до України, він поставив собі на телефон застосунок про тривоги на 2 тижні здалегідь, щоб звикнути і відчути, як це бути. Це його такий був спосіб і солідарності з Україною, але й підготовки до відрядження. Він міг бути буквально кілька днів, бо він там багато подорожує. Ми поїхали в Бучу, в Бородянку. Його надзвичайно вразив цей будинок, який був розбитий. Він потім придбав собі футболку з графіті Бенксі, яке було там в Бородянці. І зараз дуже часто на всіх публічних виступах він завжди носить футболки, які якимось чином нагадують про Україну. Буквально, коли ми спілкувалися, він приїхав з великого заходу в Італії. Він сказав, що він там був 3 дні, і в нього були 3 футболки з Україною. Він каже, це спеціально, щоб якщо я сиджу на сцені, про Україну мене не могли не спитати. Я то швед, який живе в Відні і говорить про Європу, але якщо в тебе футболка про Україну, особливо в Італії, ти маєш відповідати на це питання і додавати розмову про Україну. Мені здається, що ці деталі дуже характеризують його як людину. І, знову ж таки, я б сказала так, емоційно, мій трошечки це відчуття якогось декаденсу, яке я відчула, чесно кажучи, завдяки Карлу Генріку, він трошечки обнадіяв, що є ті люди, які, можливо, дистанціюються, можливо, десь менше турбуються, переймаються виборами в Сполучених Штатах, але завжди з нами є ось такі люди, як Карл Генрік Фредріксон, які попри все, попри те, що вони напряму не мають стосунку до України, далекі, в них є інша роль, ні на секунду, можемо так сказати, не забувають і нас підтримують.
Отож, слухаємо розмову Наталки з Карлом Генріком Фредеріксоном у Відні.
Great to finally see you again in person. I would probably make an update one of our last public conversation. In summer 2023, you came to Kiev for the book fair, which it was called like Everything Matters. And I was like really even like listening again today, this talk we had at that time. You recalled Thomas Mann in his writing in the beginning of the Second World War, when he said that we need to stop to keep this ironic distance from such terms as truce, freedom. It really worked perfectly to the, title of our exhibition at that time, of our program, because it's really about everything matters. Now I'm back in Vienna, and I've been to a number of the events, talks, and I felt like this ironic distance is fully back. Mann was speaking about early Second World War. You describe it that the invasion into Ukraine, full-scale invasion, was really the moment when we need to take away this ironic distance. But it's back. Can you maybe explain more the concept and idea, and maybe you would correct, maybe it's not back, maybe actually this distance was always here. We really never managed to destroy this gap.
I think we did. I think that you're right, but perhaps not in the way that you think, speaking from my vantage point. Basically, what I mentioned at this fantastic event at Arsenal in Kiev was I referred to a speech that Thomas Mann was supposed to give at the opening of the International Pan Congress in Stockholm in 1939. He had traveled early to Stockholm, so he was sitting in a hotel writing this speech. But while he was writing the speech, Hitler invaded Poland, which of course influenced his view of things and what he wanted to say. Thomas Mann had actually been known for someone who was proud of not being a political writer, not being a political human being or a political animal, He wrote about that as a title of one of his books to that effect. But now, 1939, and this is 6 years after the Machtübernahme in Germany, has seen what National Socialism has done to the country and has drawn the conclusions of that. Okay, our concept of humanism, of culture, of civilization is not to be taken for granted. He had been proud of keeping a distance to all those big words that I just mentioned: humanism, democracy, civilization, but also the words that you mentioned: truth, justice, taken for granted, and not even taken for granted to be criticized. An ironic distance should be taken to those words. You shouldn't fill your mouth with such big words. The war has not even started, and he writes his speech. Unfortunately, the speech will never be held because of the fact that Hitler invades Poland. The Congress is cancelled, but he gets it into the speech, and the speech is published. I came across this speech at the beginning of, I think it must have been in April, about a month after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine back in 2022. I was reading the debates and the discussions in European media and among my friends and colleagues with that in mind. And I was trying carefully to say, we're all, in my circle of friends, we grew up in post-structuralism, in postmodernism. That was, you had to be skeptical about this grand concept of truth. And I carefully tried to introduce that in the discussions. Impossible, absolutely impossible, because that was not the experience. My Swedish friends, Sweden has over 200 years without war. The continental Europe has, which is not exactly true. If you think about Georgia, you think about the annexation of Crimea in 2014, or you think about the Yugoslav wars. It's not true that this continent has been 79 years without war before this happens. This is the concept. In Sweden, there was even a writer introducing the concept of the Swedes being peace damaged. She was in a shitstorm for saying that in a country that has been living in peace for over 200 years. But it was, she actually only quoted a survivor of the Holocaust, meaning that the Swedish public sphere, the Swedish society, the Swedes were not prepared to be challenged by a really severe and serious challenge. That was my experience at the beginning of shortly after the full-scale invasion. But that changed. The discourse changed. The public sphere is suddenly dominated by exactly that insight. So we need to take this more seriously. The Ukrainians are bravely showing us that we need to be prepared. We need to be as prepared as they are, or as brave as they are, or as resilient as they are, as focused on defending these values as they are. Are we that? And many people in the European public sphere answered that question with no. And this also resulted, as the so-called Zeitenwende, has actually resulted in an enormous change of society on a political, organizational, and structural level. Meaning, for example, that budgets have been shifted. Sweden is, meanwhile, I don't know the exact figures, but I would guess that the spending on defense and military is at least double, probably triple to what it was before 2022. And that is not something that is going to disappear. And these are structural changes that are going into the bones, to the skeletons of how societies are organized. Some would criticize that. This is a militarization of politics. This is a militarization of society. This is exactly what we, during, for example, taking again the Swedish perspective, have been happy about and seen as a social, civilizational advantage, that we're not thinking in these terms. We're concentrating on childcare, on having a just social welfare state, and we're not doing this. But during this time, there is a shift in the society. However, now we're much further into this war, and the pendulum is going back again, because one sees what that means when a government is presenting a new budget and that room is no longer there, because some of that money needs to go to, Sweden again is a good example, a new NATO member, right? This means enormous difficult priorities have to be made in Swedish society. Sweden is still far more still in that Thomas Mann state of mind than Austria is at the moment. Last week I was in Italy. I was shocked, completely shocked by the atmosphere in society. I had 3 Ukrainian T-shirts with me to Italy. And every time I got on stage, I had a different T-shirt on. And it did exactly what I had hoped it would do. It provoked. But I didn't think it would provoke that much. Right now I have a Banksy T-shirt on, the girl with the balloon. I had fuck off Russian warship, the stamp on a different one. It triggered. And the Italian society, just as the Austrian society, and perhaps more importantly, the German society, the pendulum is really going back. So that I think that when you're here now in Austria, I think that your observation is completely correct. People speak differently today than they did a year ago. What that then means on the long term is a different thing, because the societies have changed profoundly. And as I said before, it has gone into the structures. But mentality-wise, it's different.
I think that there is a difference between the societies, politicians, and public intellectuals. But do you think the public intellectuals, those who are brought in this post-structural, post-modern world, are really ready? I'm speaking really exactly about them, about this circle, think that can take away this ironic distance. Because I think in the intellectual circles, in academia, it's still the camps between those who agreed and those who think no. If you want to be considered smart and not naive, by that we mean not stupid, then I need to have this ironic distance, because that's what being smart means.
It's not only what being smart means, has been the task of the public intellectual since the beginning of being a public intellectual. That's speaking truth to power, being a cosmopolitanist, being against nationalism, being against heroism, puncturing the myths that organize basically all the world societies up until the beginning of the 20th century, probably, or one would even argue until 1945. I think I mentioned that also in our talk in Kiev, but I think it's relevant here. Some of those words, right? I grew up in Sweden. I'm still a Swedish citizen. I was in Sweden when Sweden became a member of the European Union back in 1995. Austria, where we're sitting now, became a member at the same time. What we were told and what we all thought then is that we enter the post-national age. The European integration project is a post-national project. On top of that, it's a post-heroic project, because the heroism that's something of the past that's focusing on deeds that are only necessary in crisis, and crisis comes from conflict between nations. So one creator would have been, we talked about Thomas Mann before, Bertolt Brecht, who in his Galilei play, lets Galilei say, unhappy is the nation who needs the heroes. This is core pillar of the European Union. At the same time, you and I agree on the fact that Ukraine's future is a European future, as in this particular project. At the same time, Ukraine is in a situation where there are other concepts as well, but if we concentrate on those two, it's a national project. It's a nation-building project. The heroism of the Ukrainian people or the Ukrainian state and some Ukrainian individuals is mind-blowing. You can only bow your head in awe for what is being done then there. And how can these two images of what future is about or what our project is about, how can they be compatible? And I've learned also, perhaps mostly in conversations with you, because I find the nationalism project is not so difficult, because it's clear that in a post-Soviet era, there has to be some catching up, right? As a nation building is done, a nation building in a very positive sense. We're creating a community out of what perhaps wasn't a community. I don't find that so problematic. The heroism is more problematic because it's so at odds with this idea of a peaceful Europe and what the relationship between individual and collective and all this. started, of course, it started long before, but Maidan is a good example with the heavenly hunt. As that these were very personalized heroes with photos on the Maidan. You go up in Stuttgart or wherever these are, and you know the names. And I was in 2014. I was together with many other writers and academics and whatever from all over the world in Kiev. It was post Maidan, and Slavenka Drakulic was there, and she gave a lecture to a full room with young people, perhaps 70% women, as she told about her experiences in ex-Yugoslavia. And she said, I know that no Ukrainian likes to be lectured on the experience of the wars in ex-Yugoslavia, and there are lots of differences. But she said, when you no longer remember the names of those that are dead, then you know that you're in a war. And this was at the time when everyone knew the names of the Heavenly Hundred.
No, I do remember that very well, because I remember the lecture, and I remember that I used that when the invasion in the Donbass started in 2014, when we stopped to know the names, and then I said, we are at war, according to Slavenka, because I don't know any longer the people. But I'm really puzzled and would ask you to elaborate more on how to incorporate the heroes into that. Because indeed we are so unhappy, but we do have too many of them, and this heroism is still required on a daily basis. That's where I also understand that's where hard to communicate with some of the intellectuals. There are some like you who really understand and in fact help us to, from some distance to maybe verbalize some of the notions, understand us better, just write down this story in the proper words, which sometimes for me is incomprehensible and hard to explain. But yes, this particular idea referring to the myth, I would understand, just because so many dictators, so many horrible people played with mythology, played with ideas of heroism, and, that's a dangerous game. That's how a lot of murders has been done, mass killing, executions with kind of heroization, all these kind of things. So how I can return here to the peaceful world, or at least to say democratic world. What is a hero in the democratic age for, let's say, democratic liberal society?
Just telling me now that I'm offering you some insights, I would say that's the insights that I can offer are limited. But me listening to you, and this is not a club for mutual admiration now, I think that at one point I really, even publicly, put you in a very, very difficult spot on this heroism issue. And you then described a situation in Ukraine that, okay, this country is now at war, you have a lot of wounded people, and you need health care. In order to deal with that, you cannot just have, separated kind of systems doing that. And suddenly a new type of heroes arises, those who work in healthcare. And you have a functioning healthcare system, which is part also connected then again to the nation-building project, to the community-building project. But it means you need to have an organized state, and you need to have a society which is functioning. And those people who see to it that those are functioning are also these heroes. The nurses, the doctors, the transporters, the drivers of the so-called, the trains going from the east to the west, the so-called evacuation trains. And at the same time, you have this ultimate sacrifice that is being done. And I think there is no way around saying that is traumatizing Ukraine. That is traumatizing this country, as it has traumatized several other countries. Israel is a country like that, for example. And this is a huge challenge, and whether Ukraine is going to cope with that challenge or not, that's to be seen in the future. But everything that I've just been seeing about Ukraine so far is that you are really good at coping with really difficult situations. But I think that it is actually a two-way street, and that myth thing, that heroism part, I would go up any day and defend a non-nationalist view. I mean, I think that getting rid of borders in Europe is a good thing. I don't think that extreme nationalism is good in any way. I would also go up in a rostrum and give a speech defending we will try to reduce the need for heroes, in the terms of Brecht. Unhappy is a nation that needs heroes. But we're living in quite unhappy times. And perhaps Ukraine can teach us, or is teaching us, a very, very useful lesson that we need to be prepared for this type of sacrifices, for these types of heroism, and that it's up to us. But not because of an old 19th century or 17th century or 18th century view of what an hero is, but it's about defending values without which life, also social life, perhaps isn't that much work.
So I spent last day in the room with very smart people, we can call like the smartest in Europe, the editors from major publication in European countries and the US. But I felt like this usual gloom and doom about like how bad the situations are in different regions. They will joke at the same time that it was always like that. It wasn't like there was any kind of perfect time, and probably this type of people would be always like that in 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. But I was thinking about that. Why so much people saying about dysfunctional government in the UK, dysfunctional government in Austria, and you're like, guys, you don't really understand what is a dysfunctional government. Like, you can't speak about, all this type of thing. At that time, I understood that maybe, I tried to explain it to myself, and then I understood that maybe it's also exactly because if you really see that there is some problem and trouble, you need to have additional attempt to use way more resources, to accomplish that, to admit that, yes, it's maybe things, if they are not working today, it means that we need to put a bit more effort, maybe time, maybe work. I had the feeling that we so far can afford ourselves not to do that. That's why we would better complain about how bad things are, because doing something, it just requires some additional effort. So it's not really about impossibility. For me, the talks were about some impossible things. For me, it's just in fact, we just don't really feel like we really want to put additional resources into that.
That's absolutely true. I think that your colleagues that you have been talking to the last couple of days are right. I mean, there is a reason for some sign of a certain alarmism or pessimism in where the development is heading, because it's different now than it was 20 years ago. It is really different. However, dystopia has, of course, become the only game in town. And utopia is no longer on the market. I have a good friend, Ilya Troyanov, who is a German writer, who has been trying to launch again the concept of utopia and trying to different social models or whatever. A little while ago, Fredrik Jameson died, one of those postmodern house gods where we had when we grew up. The clique I was just referring to earlier, the most famous quote for him is that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, which is, again, you go for the dystopia. I think that is the thing, but I think that Ukraine is now living on the image of the future. Of course, it's an existential struggle that is happening right now of survival, because if we don't win this struggle, and this is the most pedagogical, difficult task that we have somehow now in Western democracies and in Western public spheres, to explain that. Sitting down, for example, at the peace negotiation table now basically means giving up the existence of this particular entity, even the existence of people in the occupied territories, and that's it's a difficult task. So it's an existential struggle, but it's also a struggle directed towards the future. This is where we want to be. We want to be part of that as a European community, for example. That is not a dystopia. That is a utopia. That is a positively formulated future. That what we are discussing here, and especially in intellectual circles, of course, is okay, we're heading back to the 1930s. It's exactly the opposite, right? The future is the past, right? This is here. And Ukraine, again, I don't wish for any of the countries that are, for example, part of the European Union or also outside, Georgia, Moldova, or, whatever, to have to suffer the fate of Ukraine or the fate that Ukraine is suffering right now. But still, Ukraine has something to teach us.
I have quite a few questions in particular about Europe. Exactly because of that, I'd like to explain you what exactly your position, because you are the founder of Eurozine and the program director on the debates on Europe. So maybe then for our listeners, it would be easier to understand, from which pretext you say. So what are these debates on Europe? So what are you doing?
Debates on Europe is a joint project of the S. Fischer Stiftung, the S. Fischer Foundation, which is based in Berlin, and the German Academy for Language and Literature. It started about 12 or 13 years ago. The idea is to go to places where the idea of Europe is at stake in one way or the other. Some of these early debates took place, for example, in Budapest or in Sarajevo. But there were also debates in Kharkiv. I don't know if it was 2015 or 2016. As not far from the front lines at the time, we organized this together with Zhadan, who was doing a fantastic work at that time. His views were different then. I don't want to put him in a difficult situation, but his views were about the prospects of how this would actually develop was different. And we tried to have a discussion in Kharkiv about a European future for Ukraine, an understanding between, at that time, Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers was a very big thing. This was part of this discussion. The idea is then to hook up with the local intellectual life, then have grand thinkers such as Zhadan, for example, writers, but also bring in people who are not necessarily experts on post-Soviet space or on Ukraine or on Russia or, whatever, but writers, intellectuals, academics, journalists that have no real clear idea about what that is. And I have seen during these trips, and especially Kharkiv was probably the best example of that, on how suddenly these people, you could see it in their faces, how they understood something. They understood that this is not a civil war. And this is what we're trying to do in these contexts.
Following that, in this podcast, somehow it just happened by the nature of my work, our work. We were for the last year very much focused in the globe, in, various continents, but also the US, the war crimes. And really, I hadn't been speaking almost like not at all about Europe, European Union, but Europe as such. And I wanted to explain Europe stands on this war depending on the countries. Because what is interesting for me when I'm, especially now with all the risks in the US, disregarding the elections, we can speak separately on that. US for some time would be so much preoccupied on the US. And, I think Ukraine needs to understand better Europe and European Union and Europe as such. But while explaining to friends and colleagues in Korea, Mexico, Chile, who are Ukrainian biggest allies, I kind of understood, I was saying, like, beyond the Balts, that would be Swedes, Danish, Dutch, the UK. But then I understood it actually like the Scandinavians. Finland, obviously. I understand because they're close to Russia, but it's very interesting because, these are not the most hawkish countries. Actually, these are very different type of countries when you think about NATO, about the US invasions in the Middle East. These are usually countries which are considered globally this kind of, not these former empires who have the horrible colonial history globally, because countries like UK is a bit separate, but also it's one thing. It's very separate. But you really say that, this is a country which has a very good reputation internationally in the whole globe. And they are our Ukrainian biggest supporters. I want to really explain, first of all, the Scandinavian, maybe separate particular countries, and then just explain, maybe for what reasons it just happened that during this war, they are the ones.
I think that there are many different reasons for this, actually. I would contradict you also saying these are not empires. Basically, Sweden was an empire that had a very specific competitor, namely Russia. It all changed and shifted up until 1709 at the Battle of Poltava. Sweden was the man in Northern Europe, including Russian space. But it's a long time ago, and Sweden has forgotten its imperial past. I referred before to the 200 years well over 200 years of peace. And that has also meant something. Sweden and UK, for example, have been very similar in one respect when it comes to Europe. Both have been quite Eurosceptical throughout history. And for the UK, continental Europe, it has always been that place where you have to go and fix things. And you have to sacrifice blood, sweat, and tears and human life in order to fix things there. So it's better not to be too attached and to stay away. For Sweden, continental Europe has always been, or in the last 200 years at least, that place where if you stay out of it, you're good. You don't go there and fix it. No, you stay out, and that's good. Now, the situation is different. So as you know, Sweden is, but also long before Sweden became a NATO member, Sweden was in support of Ukraine and the Ukrainian cause. And let me come back to that. But that Sweden became a NATO member had less to do with Sweden than with Finland. Because Finland and Sweden are historically, but also very practically today, when it comes to defense issues, tied together like this. And if Finland says, no, everything changed with March 2022. We now need to join NATO. And it went very, very quickly in Finland. And when Finland says that, Sweden has no choice. Sweden has to, because Sweden cannot stay neutral anymore, whether they wanted that or not, or we wanted that or not. And the democratic process in Sweden joining the NATO alliance is not really a good example of how democracy works and so on. But Finland, Denmark, Sweden are all small countries. And small countries depend on a world order that protects and safeguards the agency, the integrity of these nations. Otherwise, they become pawns on a chess table or zones of interest that belongs here or belongs there. That world order starts in the Helsinki Accords, or in the Helsinki Final Agreement, goes up to the Paris Accords of the OSCE, and is visible, for example, in the Budapest Memorandum and in all sorts of different things. But these are papers. These are documents. There are organizations built. The OSCE, I can discuss the efficiency of that organization, but it's supposed to safeguard the post-Cold War order. This is every nation has the right to choose what organization to join, whether that is the European Union or if that is NATO or whatever it is. That's clear that no other nation has anything to say when so. And then suddenly Ukraine wants to go on the Ukrainian path, and someone pulls the brake on that. And as of Georgians will be a bit mad perhaps, but I think one can say as of 2014. That post-Cold War order is no more. But the fragments still remain. And this is what Finland wants to preserve. This is what Denmark and Sweden wants to preserve. That world order. And apart from the fact that Ukraine is an example of a breach against that world order, saying, okay, this is the victim here of a brute big power as if this was the Vienna Congress in 1815 or whatever. That is, so to say, an emotional part of it. But I think that it's also done in self-interest, in great self-interest. And if Ukraine is gone, then Sweden and Denmark and Finland needs to fear as well.
By the way, you were the ones who were really arguing for the Sweden joining NATO. How is the process? So what's actually going on in the country with that?
It's difficult to explain to an outsider how important the so-called neutral status of Sweden was. Has been such a strong and crucial an integral part of the Swedish identity. However, it was not neutrality. This is a misconception. One speaks of neutrality all the time. Sweden was not supposed to be part of any alliance aiming for neutrality in case of war. Basically, it was an alliance-free status that Sweden had. And you can see that it was not a neutral position if you go back and look into, for example, the speeches of Olof Palme. Olof Palme was speaking in parliament, in radio interviews on the street about the Vietnam War. He was naming the Hanoi bombings in the same long list of atrocities throughout history, including Katyn or Sharpeville, several of these absolute atrocities. And his finger was directed towards Washington. At the same time, he made these interviews and stood up in parliament and talked on the streets and pointed the finger to Moscow after the Soviet invasion of Prague. And this was the idea that the Swedes had. We were this good thing in between these evil empires. On the one hand, the unregulated capitalism in the US, and on the other hand, the communist system.
By the way, I'd like to, maybe you would also explain on the, something you told me a while ago, kind of this, a bit of the, could we say, this disappointment of the North Europe with the part of the Eastern Bloc, that after the fall of the Soviet Union, instead of becoming these good guys who kind of can escape communism, falling right into the hands of the market. So how it's going on, maybe you would also explain, and how you see it's all ended up where we are now.
Yeah, but this is exactly the point. So Olof Palme is defending this neutral. I don't want to heroize now Olof Palme, but he's a very good exponent for this idea. I was breastfed with this neutral position. We were these good guys. And then comes 89. Exactly as you say, the people in GDR, in Czechoslovakia, in Russia, in Ukraine, wherever, or in the Soviet Union, had this fantastic chance. Come, join us. We are not those degenerated, untamed capitalists. Join us. No, that doesn't happen. Eastern Europe runs straight into the arms of the US and of the UK. It's a kind of very, very capitalist system. And we take it personal. We Swedes, we say, what? Look at them. And this is feeding a skepsis towards Eastern Europe. It then comes again with the invasion of Iraq and the coalition of the willing, and Sweden is still a neutral state and has this skeptical view. And Eastern Europeans are simply confirming the fact that they are belonging to one of those evils that we tried not to be. They left one, but now they go to this other. And this is, of course, not a Swedish view. This is part of a political part of Sweden, but which was dominating Sweden at the time. And this, I think that it's nothing less of a miracle. It's really a wonder that Sweden has meanwhile changed completely on its view towards, we realize meanwhile, the problem is, of course, that Poland is a Catholic country. Sweden is religious Protestant, but it's not religious at all, it's secular. So, but still, we're even starting to actually acknowledge Poland is actually an important country. Poland is a country that will be part of deciding our common European future. The solidarization with Ukraine in Sweden is, if you compare it to Italy, if you compare it to Austria, something has happened there. Norway is even more. Norway is even more. There are more Ukrainians in Norway than there are in Sweden as refugees. But exactly what has happened here, it's not sure. Sweden has gone through so radical changes, and there are not only positive changes. The time that I spoke about before, Sweden was arguably the most equal place on earth since the beginning of Earth. We had a tax system that was socialist. Inheritance tax was 90%. Gift tax was 90%. Today, it's 0%, which means that there's a total shift toward a different way of thinking, a different sense of belonging. But I think that, coming back to it again, I think that the real important part of this is that it's actually a value system. There's a world order that has been challenged. My argument is that it's actually not been challenged, it's been swept away already by Putin and his regime. And Sweden does everything, Finland does everything, Denmark does everything, Norway does everything in order to defend those values that were at the core of that world order.
This neutrality is often equalized with kind of pacifism, but the pacifism can be very different. There is like the German pacifism, which the tradition is very different and clear to one, or like even the Austrian one. But what I find interesting, that because Sweden wasn't in NATO, it had an army. You served in the army. And it felt like the countries where quite a few people served in the army, they treat it in, let's say, more normal way. They are not panicking, like the Germans, like the Japanese, which had to abolish their armies. Can you combine the idea of this neutrality pacifism, but also the necessity of having a legit armed force, including, which can be totally separate? Let's not forget that Sweden is one of the huge weapon producers also.
That it's all tied together, Nataliya. I mean, if you're neutral, as opposed to Austria, Sweden's neutrality, let's call it still neutrality, even if it was actually about being not part of an alliance, but Swedish neutrality was not based in the constitution. The Austrian neutrality is based in the constitution. It's very difficult to change. It will have to change at some point, but the Swedes would not. But the Swedes had realized what the Austrians had not realized. If you're a neutral country, you need to be able to defend yourself. And in order to defend yourself and still keep your neutrality, you need to be producer of weapons. It's a very kind of down-to-earth, realistic, kind of logical thought. At the same time, of course, Sweden was a very pacifist country in trying to mediate in all different conflicts in the Middle East or wherever that was the case. But it was a sober realism when it came to, okay, if we're neutral, we need to have a military capability of defending ourselves. However, after 89, that completely disappeared. Up until 89, Sweden has that, and there were of course reminiscences of that still there. But then what used to be mandatory subscription, as if you did your service, as you had good reasons not to serve, and if you didn't have that, you got to jail. Right? This was the case when I grew up. But as of 89, this disappears. It comes to a stage when the commander of the Swedish armed forces is saying, we will not be able to defend ourselves, not even a week. No big reactions in society to this. Then comes the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And it shifts in a day. And as opposed to Finland had kept this capability all the time.
Of course, with that border.
With the border, the longest border to Russia in Europe, as long as the rest of the border in Europe to Russia. But Sweden had to rediscover it, and has actually rediscovered it very, very, very quickly. The number of people that now want to go into to serve with weapon in their hand is surging. If there's a line even to different types of military organizations. And there is an understanding that this is necessary. However, that there is a very, very strong pacifist movement in Sweden as well. However, it's not as big as it is, for example, in Germany. But I have to tell you, and this is a little bit of a sidetrack, but it shows also where Sweden has actually been all this time. When I was doing my military service, we had a Warsaw Pact week and we have a NATO week. And this was at the time when Sweden was completely neutral or supposedly neutral. During the Warsaw Pact week, we got for breakfast red beet soup. We got for lunch red beet soup. We got for dinner red beet soup. For 7 days, the same thing. Then comes NATO week. Pancakes with syrup for breakfast. Hamburger for lunch. T-bone steak for dinner, right? And variations. So, I mean, if that is not indoctrination,
but why they would do that?
Like, because they would in a not so subtle way. explain to us, where do we actually belong in case of, I mentioned Olof Palme before. Olof Palme was assassinated in 1986, and there was then, this is recorded actually somewhere, and the documents are there. There's some high military calling in to the government quarters and say, I'm ready, I can go. And he had all the papers in a briefcase and in a few suitcases, and were set to go to Washington, because one didn't know when Palme was killed, is this a coup d'etat? Is this an attack from Russia? Is this whatever? I'm ready to go, and he would go to Washington. So this neutrality part was a little bit of a Potemkin thing.
There was something very interesting. You said that when there was, after the full-scale invasion, when it was kind of clear that the Ukrainian men are not allowed to leave the country, you said like that in Sweden, the debates were, why just men? So what's the point? Like, it's like all the citizens are not allowed to leave in case of the war? Sweden, so...
It's a classical feminist thought. What is this kind of patriarchal system? Why should the men not be allowed? But most of those who said that probably thought that the men should be able to leave as well. But the logical conclusion is, of course, no. If the men have to stay and fight, why not the women? Are the women not worth?
But what are the rules in Sweden? So if there is a war,
everyone has to stay.
What is that? Is it a law? Is it like a decree?
I don't know exactly, but this is my distinct... I think this is actually true, what I'm saying now. No one is allowed to leave. And this is also something, Nataliya, which is making me upset all the time. For example, now I'm shifting the subject a little bit, but it's important. For example, when press freedom in Ukraine is discussed, right? Oh, look. Or in connection with corruption. And I'm trying to tell the people I discuss these issues with, Ukraine has 5 channels in television, right? But they are taking turns in sending the same things. It's not ideal. It's not, what you think would be press freedom and whatever. But what would you think it would be like in Austria if Austria would be at war, or in Sweden? Do you think that would that this isn't it? Yeah, but the corruption. Yeah, isn't it fantastic that they in wartime there's martial law, and there are investigative journalism coming up with this or that, and it's being also acted upon this. But this goes back to the martial law thing. So when Sweden then happened, at the same time, you had a minister who was saying, well, if war would come to us, I would go to war. The minister, she actually had to resign for this and for other things as well. But, the thing is, I don't think that she would be allowed. I don't think that anyone is allowed to go out of Sweden in case of war. But Swedes are not aware of this. And it's not putting the fact that Ukraine is 3 years into a full-scale war, and it's dealing with it in this fantastic way. What do you think would be in Sweden during similar circumstances?
Impossible. Something you told that, when a lot of people would say like, oh, Ukraine, NATO, it's impossible. And then you reminded that West Germany was admitted into NATO in the 50s, not just because it was divided and separated, but it was a very special country, which 10 years before that committed something like horrible. Why you think there are so much impossible? And maybe you say like, to what extent then Ukraine is impossible in NATO in this regard, in this terms? Or like, why impossible is so often in our political dictionary?
It's not difficult to understand that a lot of people would be skeptical towards taking Ukraine into NATO. If you take Article 5 seriously, any action on the side of Russia that would include part of Ukraine would trigger the full force of NATO. This is what Article 5 is saying. The skepsis, this fear is understandable. But that fear is founded in the fact that Ukraine does not control its own territory. In the case where Ukraine would control its own territory, meaning that the front lines would not go back or forth, and of course that would have to mean that there's some kind of agreement on where the borders of Ukraine are, that is recognized also from the big neighbor to the north. That is what is not being discussed. Right? if there is such an agreement, and after the Budapest Memorandum turned out to be nothing than a piece of paper, the security guarantees that Ukraine need and very logically needs and demands to have cannot be a piece of paper. Right? It has to be something else. And I cannot see that it can be anything else than NATO membership and troops on Ukrainian soil, as a foreign troops on Ukrainian soil, foreign weapons on Ukrainian soil. This has to be. And the second part of that, as foreign weapons on Ukrainian soil, as rockets in Ukraine, will, if you take a realistic view of things, be a very difficult thing to get through any type of negotiation. NATO membership without the stationing of weapons in Ukraine might not. But that means that the NATO members, and they include countries like Turkey or, whatever, would have to agree to the fact that, okay, Ukraine controls its territory.
But I would rather ask this impossible thing. So, people just saying things like, this is impossible, the foreign troops is impossible. Is it like really we lack resources that, like, European countries and the others lack resources so much that there is this discussion, it's impossible, we can't.
That is a general insight that one should have. We have seen so many examples of where the impossibilities turns into reality in a very short time. My example with Germany was that if you look at this from today's perspective, and okay, Germany wages a war on half of Europe, commits the most awful atrocities that on a scale that this continent has not seen, and 10 years later is a member of NATO. And it is nothing else than an impossibility, but it happened. Therefore, one should not exclude any of this. And this is also what I tried to say before. The current political climate is one of dystopia and not one of possibility or utopia. But it's not enough to say we need to develop a new plan or whatever. Politics is done in action.
We're talking before the US elections, and I'll have quite a few particular discussions on the US elections, so it's not really about explaining Trump or something. But what do you think, would be the role of Europe if Europe understands that the US would be so much into their own issues for foreseeable future?
I think it's really a mistake to say that, okay, if Kamala Harris win, all is good and we continue as we do. No. Even if Kamala Harris wins, she has a huge pile of work on home turf. Of course, that will be much, much better from the perspective of Ukraine, but it's not safe. And if Europe is serious in its support for Ukraine, and not only is, pulling in the same direction as US are, and if US are not, okay, then we're not. But if Europe is serious about its commitment to Ukraine, about its commitment to the world order that has been established in the Paris Accords and so on, and that an aggressive war cannot pay off, then Europe have to step up. And that is not dependent on whether Trump wins or not.
To return back to Ukraine, so you're following closely what's going on to extent it's possible. You deeply care. So what are your questions now? What are the things you like watching out? What matters for you when you're looking at even discussion outside of Ukraine regarding Ukraine, but also inside? What are the things you kind of worried, but also you're still following and trying to explain to people here?
My most concerns are that's the new mobilization laws. I was not so long ago in Lviv. This was shortly after the new mobilization law were actually implemented. There were colleagues of mine that had been taken into a bus or, going somewhere. Those people are all still saying Ukraine needs to be defended and we need to defend, but it comes so much closer. The diction starts to get different. This is my concern, and this is what I'm trying to figure, because this is also something that one cannot talk about. One cannot talk about that openly too much. Because if you do that, you give the impression of, well, Ukraine anyway wants to give up now. And Ukraine is tired. You cannot... No, that's not at all the impression I'm getting. Everyone is still, on this track. But what does that mean for the atmosphere in Ukrainian society? And this is where I right now see, from my vantage point from without, I see the really, really sore point in Ukrainian society.
Indeed, I'll confirm we did the research in which we kind of looked exactly into that, but also warning that the concerns Ukrainians have cannot be equalized to their views on the end of the war or the way, should be done. But there are issues, and I would probably, confirm that these are one of the most critical, together with arms supply and all other things. So, Karl Henrik, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks for teaching me things, Nataliya.